So Modest Mouse has been around for a long time, longer than most indie rock bands have been around. Modest Mouse is a Washington rock band led by singer, songwriter, and multi-instrumentalist Isaac Brock. And while the band has changed and switched members, the same sound has been, for the most part, unique and consistent. This is because of Brock's unique vocals and lyrics, opting to make more songs about his personal life and hardships and how it has kind of shaped his perception of the world. The thing that sets this apart from, just being another woe is me type band is Brock's harsh anger and how it kind of dances on the edge of being cynical while not being an overt edgelord about it. Instead of blaming the world at large about the problems he faces, he instead takes a shot out of himself, through self-deprecation, hammering home that while life may suck and is unfair, it's ultimately your fault and what you do about it. Of course, this doesn't prevent Brock from frequently bad-mouthing other ideas, people, artists, through his songs, which I think can ultimately ground the band, because while they may put down certain ideas, they're not above taking potshots at themselves. This is a motif that has appeared in almost all of their albums, and this is what we're going to be counting down today. I'll be looking at the worst to best albums that Modest Mouse has released. This will only include the studio albums, however, so this will include EPs like The Fruit That Ate Itself and No One's First But You're Next. I do this for one of two reasons. One is to prevent this from being an hour-long video, and the other is to chronicle the band's sound through the years because I feel like if you go from studio album to studio album, it's more of a gradual change than if you were to go through the many other EPs where the change is kind of minimal at best. So, let's get started. Strangers to Ourselves is Modest Mouse's most recent studio album, and in my opinion, their most diverse sounding album. However, I have to put it at the worst album on this list because it's the only album that I really found that was a chore to get through. What immediately sets this album apart from the others in their discography is the opening track, the self-entitled Strangers to Ourselves. Now, with each album, Modest Mouse hasn't really wasted an intro song. The album This Is a Long Drive for Someone with Nothing to Think About opens with the powerfully somber Dramamine, and Good News with The World at Large, and so on. But with Strangers to Ourselves, it's neither explosive enough to get the listener excited, or provocative and powerful enough to really kind of appropriately set expectations. The track features a very heavy string ensemble with Brock's vocals almost at a whisper, which I found to be almost too boring to listen to. Now, as soon as the track ends, we get arguably the best track in the record, Lampshades on Fire. This indie pop rock anthem embodies everything that Modest Mouse has stood for since the beginning, a callback to their roots, if you will. Both instrumentally and lyrically, Lampshades on Fire showcases the band's full sound in this modern LP. Unfortunately, the rest of the tracks aren't really enough to write home about. We get some very good singles on this record, Ansel and Coyote showing off Brock's classical lyrical style and provide some decent instrumentation. While I like the song, Sugar Boats for its, twangy, drunken piano sound and over-the-top big circus sound, I wish that Brock's vocals matched that energy. Instead, we have a song where the vocals just really don't meet the energy of the instrumentation, which is something that I find would bring the song all together. If you want to listen to this record, this is an instance where the singles on the album are just overall better than the experience. I feel if you're going to really pick out the best, I'd stick with Lampshades on Fire and maybe Sugar Boats if you really want to get past the vocals, and maybe and definitely check out Ansel and Coyote. Now, it would appear that I'm just working backwards from the new shit, but hear me out. We Were Dead's nautical theme lends itself to the band's overall song and attitude. The two seem to really kind of come together. And this album comes after their mainstream hit album, Good News for People Who Love Bad News, and the level of production shows, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Fans often have a divide between the produced albums and the more raw and blunt albums, things like Good News and We Were Dead, and perhaps the Moon and Antarctica being the pivotal divide between the fan base. More importantly, this is the band's first #1 album as far as charts go, but to be more to the point, this list isn't exactly what was worst to best. From this point on, it's more of like a least good to most good. And I say that because there really are a lot of things to like about this album. The album starts with a nice, strong song with March into the Sea, which takes after a sea shanty of sorts and sets up the overall energy that this album will ultimately deliver on. And with tracks like Dashboard, Steamin' Genius, and Florida, this album hits most of those, beat with your chest, yeah, moments that, the rawer sound of Modest Mouse has been known for. Unique to this album is the addition of the Shins frontman James Mercer, which lends his smooth voice to Isaac's lispy, angry vocals on tracks like Florida and Missed the Boat. Where this album definitely falls is its lack of, a cohesive motif. Yes, the portions of the songs are to this nautical theme and offer that high energy and offer a, consistent sound. But the tracks in between, like Spitting Venom and Little Motels, are more like just B-sides that weren't good enough for Good News. And while I think this is more of a well-put-together album than Strangers to Ourselves, We Were Dead sinks to this spot, which again isn't all bad. There are some solid tracks on this record, but largely, it's just for the first half. Okay, so for the remainder of this list, I'm just going to be referring to this as the Road Trip album, because this is a full title, it's just too long, and, I know what people are thinking, why'd you put this album so low? Are you drunk? Are you stupid? And the answer to all those questions is yes. But, more importantly, The Road Trip offers, in my opinion, the best opening track to a record ever. And you may, or may not, fight me on that. Dramamine is a slow, powerful, sobering song about getting high to escape reality and relationships and shit. But more importantly, Dramamine offers the band's very first impression to a mainstream audience. I shouldn't say mainstream, more to a studio audience, since this is the very first song on their very first studio album, and they kicked the door down with this track. What you'll find with early Modest Mouse tracks is that you can go into sometimes absurd detail over the structure and meaning of a single song, Dramamine being the example in the Road Trip album. However, the album of course offers more than just one track. The question is, are they worth talking about? Yes, but not by much. For the rest of this album, it offers the raw anger and grit that made Modest Mouse unique, and would, you'd think that virtue would be higher. And keep in mind, this isn't a bad to worst, this is any stretch of the imagination, but what this record presents is done better by albums like The Lonesome, Crowded West and The Moon and Antarctica. Speaking of which... easily the most existential album the band has released. The Moon and Antarctica delves into the meaning of life and our place in the universe with their own brand of grounded nihilism that they have been building up since the Road Trip album. The opening track for this album, Third Planet, sets the listener up with the expectations with a song that talks about our inevitable death and how Brock laments about how, while he considers his only art to be his music, he does it in a very cynical and, holistic way. What we've seen from the band so far, this being their third album, has been a very raw and unapologetic sound. And while this album is perhaps just as blunt with its message as the previous albums, the production speaks volumes about how far the band has come so far. Now, while fans would like to later comment on the record being too overproduced, I think this is the point where people are talking about the divide when it comes to the Moon and Antarctica, because the lyrics and even the sound of the band are still largely intact and do not go under major changes until later records. The beginning of this album starts strong and just remains stronger, similarly with memorable songs like Gravity Writes Everything that gives us some nice psychedelic acoustics and that seems to glide the listener into the next powerful track, Perfect Disguise. And yet the album seems to meander around for a few tracks, less than when We Were Dead Before the Ship Even Sank, mind you, but the tracks like Alone Down There and Wild Packs of Family Dogs seem to be kind of missing the mark as far as the overall cohesiveness of the album, but that quickly veered back with the very catchy and very poppy Paper Thin Walls. In the end, I think I can appreciate this album, what it set out to accomplish, more than what the record actually is. This album stepped up the lyrical complexity of Modest Mouse without sacrificing the image that they have cultivated for almost 10 years prior. As this garage band from the bosoms of Seattle and Olympia in the town of Issaquah, and here comes the surprise upset. When looking through the popular opinions of the best albums according to the fans, most list this album on the bottom half, opting to move in reverse order from their most recent to the oldest. However, I don't think I can justify not putting Good News as number 2 on this list. There's simply too much weight to this record to put it lower. Forgetting the radio jams and poppiness of Float On, there's actually a lot to talk about this when it comes to this album. Now, this acts as Modest Mouse's mainstream hit. While We Were Dead Before the Ship Even Sank managed to hit number 1 in the US, even the fans have to give it to Good News, and that's because this record kills. After a short horn interlude, we're given to the calm and very kind of poppy World at Large, which is a good framework for this album. The minimal and repeated notes that drift down and slow down and to float on. And now, just to be transparent and open, I was introduced to Modest Mouse through Float On. Yeah, I'm normie as shit over here, and I have to say, if I had just left it at that, I probably wouldn't have continued on with this record. I've grown to appreciate Float On later in life, and I can say that it's nowhere near the worst song the band has ever produced. Yeah, it's bubblegum, and it gets the radio plays, but I can at least tell that the band put their whole ass into this song. I think a lot of the lyrical tricks and aspects of a Modest Mouse song lie in Float On, but the fact that it's so mainstream kind of fogs people's perspective, at least in my opinion. Well, in any case, I wanted to move on to the tons of other amazing tracks on this album, like the dark and spot-on track Bukowski, where we learn that Brock reads. Yes, he does indeed read. Of course, knowing Bukowski's style, it's a match made in heaven. We haven't even gotten to my personal favorite on this track, Bury Me With It, where the crashing drums and guitar explode on each chorus with this driving and kind of funky bass line that dominates the verses. Paired with the top quality lines like, "We were aiming for the moon, we were shooting for the stars, but the kids were just shooting at the buses and the cars." I could go on the amazing tracks, like Black Cadillacs, The View, but I think the number 1 spot is long overdue. You all knew it. Was there ever any doubt as to who would get the number 1 spot? Oh, hell no. Hell no. Remember back when I said that the Road Trip album established Modest Mouse with a solid first impression album? Well, this album, agreed by nearly across the board, is the album to define the band. Every track on this record seems to improve upon what came before it, and it perfects that raw, unfiltered anger and image that Modest Mouse has created over the years before they released their first album. In fact, I would go on to start just naming all the good tracks on this album, like, Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine and Out of Gas, but I think there's just only one track on this record that stands above all else. Cowboy Dan. Yes, Cowboy Dan is a major player in the cowboy scene. He goes to the reservation, drinks, and gets mean. This track, let me tell you about this track. Can I tell you about this track? Cowboy Dan embodies everything this album was meant to convey, the commercialization of the West. Ickasaw was a small town between the giants of the indie pop scene, Seattle and Olympia. Brock and the band, they saw their small town being overrun with, malls, shopping centers, and all the other commercialist aspects. And this album was born from that frustration and anger. All that emotion, all that passion is showcased perfectly by this one song, and it is smack dab in the middle of the record. The heavy, driving bells that meant to signify the spurs of the boots, the twangy and eerie riff that plays throughout the song evokes that sense of helplessness, and that bass line just shoots in to represent that growing rise of futility and anger. And after the interlude, we are given to some of the best lyrics and one of the best one-liners that Brock has to offer, Every time you think you're walking, You're just moving the ground. It speaks to the futility of it all, but instead of breaking down and lamenting, it picks up. The song gets mad. And then I do. But it takes more than Cowboy Dan to sell this record as the number one spot. The other tracks on this record tell their own story, and while I walked away from this album thinking Cowboy Dan was the tour de force of the record, none of the other songs are put here to support it. The song Out of Gas has a tired bass line and dragging drum beat that perfectly simulates that feeling of just being stranded on a road for the long highway. Put simply, this record perfects what the Road Trip album was supposed to accomplish. So that was my list. Did you like it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Either way, let me know in the comments down below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so I can know that I should do more of these in the future. Okay? I don't know how to make it. I don't know.